The rivalry between the United States and Russia has become a staple of contemporary thought. Since the Cold War, the two surviving superpowers were locked in a global struggle for the dominance of their ideologies and the supremacy of their individual might. The Russian-led Soviet Union had established its sphere of influence in the East, while the United States established its own in the West, but ultimately the Soviet Union collapsed, and for the time it seemed that a rapprochement between the two superpowers could have manifested. However, quickly disagreements emerged. Early post-Soviet Russian leadership found itself unable to stabilize the broken country, while attempts at bringing Russia into the Western Bloc floundered on account of distrust on both sides, systemic incompatibilities, and shortcomings of Russian leadership. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, Russia and the United States became allies? Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another alternate history scenario for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have videos like this every week, so remember to subscribe and stay tuned. Russia's first pro-Western president was Boris Yeltsin. He was hailed by many as the man who would liberalize and democratize Russia, and he was even directly supported by foreign powers when his re-election bid came under threat. However, Yeltsin's reforms were regarded very poorly within Russia, having a visibly negative effect upon the economy, seemingly opening the nation up to predation by corporations and oligarchs both foreign and domestic. And soon it became apparent that Yeltsin intended on pushing his democratic reforms through whether the public approved of them or not, using military force against the Russian parliament who sought to impeach him for unconstitutional behavior. Despite this, he remained within the West's good graces, yet could not advance Russia into Western institutions. Many in the West plainly still did not trust Russia and argued that it was too early to make any determination as to Russia's status in regard to the West. This ambiguity reached a breaking point when Russian geopolitical interests began to be compromised. Russia's ally of Serbia saw intervention within its borders by NATO, while the West opposed Russia's efforts to reintegrate the secessionist state of Chechnya. Distrust rose and increasingly the two grew distant. A Russian-American alliance under Yeltsin isn't out of the question, but not only would major disagreements arise in the years following, but this would also be a very different Russia than the country we know today. Yeltsin's leadership, if it had been given the green light by the West as the model that future Russian leaders should follow, would have seen the country suffer far greater degrees of corruption and abuses of power, masked by the veneer of democracy, all while still seeing support from the West. Instead, let's consider a circumstance in which it seemed that Russia was prepared to throw its lot in with the United States for a long-term partnership during the early administration of Vladimir Putin. September 11, 2001 was a day of disaster for the United States. A terror attack had been conducted upon both the World Trade Center in New York and upon the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. In the midst of the chaos, the first foreign leader to call then-President George W. Bush was Vladimir Putin, and the conversation ended with Putin offering the United States Russia's support in locating and defeating the terrorists responsible. Russia would provide the United States access to bases in Central Asia, grant access to Russian airspace, share intelligence on terror groups, provided a small deployment of 1,000 soldiers to Afghanistan, and supported American resolutions in the UN Security Council related to the war on terror. Despite the promise this alliance offered, there was little reciprocity on the part of the US, which discouraged Russia from further investment in the alliance. Still, Russia pursued rapprochement or a resetting of relations with the United States during every subsequent American administration until the election of Joe Biden, with the conflict in Ukraine seemingly representing a final breaking of faith in the potential for this alliance under current circumstances. But this time, things are different. In our timeline, the 9/11 attacks led to the activation of NATO's Article 5, meaning that in this alternate timeline, Russia wouldn't simply be fighting alongside the United States, but the collective West as a whole. The War on Terror, in particular Operation Enduring Freedom or the war in Afghanistan, would have truly given Russia an opportunity to shine as an ally. Russia had itself occupied Afghanistan some decades prior during its time as the Soviet Union from 1979 to 1989, and would have been more familiar with the conditions and political dynamics of the country. Russia's proximity to Afghanistan also reduces the strain that would have been placed upon American logistics. Russia has a vested interest in the stability of Central Asia, which it considers an integral part of its political sphere, and would operate more surgically than the United States, which at times acted very haphazardly in this theater of conflict. For instance, American reliance upon air power led to a dramatically high civilian casualty count, which only further diminished America's reputation among the Afghans. Russia, as a tried and proven land power, would have approached the conflict differently and highly discouraged this kind of recklessness. Beyond this, Russia's investment in the region would mean a desire to prop up a capable government rather than a merely friendly government. In our own timeline, the United States overlooked rampant corruption and underqualification within the allied Afghan government for the sake of simply having a reliable friend. But again, as the US's reputation among the Afghans crumbled, it became harder to find more qualified men willing to cooperate with this invading force. The Russians had already learned this lesson the hard way during their own occupation and wouldn't allow the US to make the same mistake. Efforts would be made to appeal to both urban and rural populations to strangle out sources of Taliban support. This would allow the Allied forces to better secure the more rugged sections of the border with Pakistan where Taliban forces were able to cross freely and resupply or seek shelter. If this was done early enough and prior to the rapid capture of the Taliban-held capital, it's quite possible that bin Laden wouldn't have fled to Pakistan, believing his position in Afghanistan to be secure enough for the time being. Regardless of whether or not that's the case, Russia's relations with Pakistan and enhanced scrutiny in the region may have allowed for bin Laden's earlier discovery had he managed to escape. Russia would almost certainly take the lead in rebuilding Afghanistan once it was felt that the Taliban had been adequately suppressed in the region, aspiring to transform it into a resource-rich and stable ally. Local powers like Iran and Pakistan would look more favorably to an Afghanistan under the influence of Russia than the United States. Iran by this point would have already developed a positive relation with the Russians, while Pakistan was more trusting of Russia than it was to the US, with whom it had been aligned on and off. Depending upon circumstances in Afghanistan and how willing the US was to trust the alliance with Russia, the Russians may be able to dissuade the US from invading Iraq in 2003 and forcing regime change in that state. Russia in our own timeline had opposed the invasion, seeing it as unnecessary and destabilizing to a country with which it had fairly cordial relations. Russia had been one of Iraq's chief weapons suppliers and insisted on pressuring Iraq instead to accept military inspections. For the sake of this scenario and maintaining the Russo-American alliance, we'll suppose that the US places its trust in Russia and a compromise is made to have Russian inspectors investigate the country for alleged weapons of mass destruction, which, as we know now, never existed. Iraq is never destabilized, and as a consequence we never see the rise of radical Islamic factions in the Near East, namely the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. Russia would develop a greater sphere of influence within the Middle East thanks to the friendly secular regimes of Iraq and Syria. The war on terror wouldn't be over, and insurgencies would continue in various parts of Asia and Africa, but with Russia by the US's side, the major theaters of conflict would be pacified far earlier on. So, what's next? Post-Cold War policy for both countries was distinct, yet in some ways rather similar. Russia felt as though it was still a slowly recovering power, but despite this, felt it remained an equal to the United States and wanted to be treated as such in any arrangement between the two. Russia wanted to regain influence over what it considered its sphere in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Near East, restore its domestic economy, raise standard of living above those of the Soviet era, and establish a new global order with it and the United States as peacekeepers. The United States, having won the Cold War, had fully adopted the global peacekeeper role and sought to shape what it considered a freer, more democratic world, what George H.W. Bush referred to as the New World Order. This idealistic model rapidly ran into roadblocks, with some states proving unreceptive to democratic governments, corruption and coercion becoming necessary for maintaining stability in some parts of the world, the US looking the other way toward undemocratic but valuable nations like Saudi Arabia, while states like Iraq were deemed members of a new axis of evil. If Russia and the United States were to cooperate in the long term, both would need to reevaluate their global strategies and long-term goals. Perhaps ironically, given future events, Russia during these early days would have been the more level-headed partner in the relationship. Still, recovering Russia would be more open to compromising with the US, while the US, having just won the Cold War and standing as the sole superpower, felt as though it could do whatever it wanted. While disagreements could definitely be expected, there are a handful of common goals the two would almost certainly come to agree on. For the sake of global stability and to help shore up their own positions as dual superpowers, nuclear proliferation would need to be culled and a gradual process of denuclearization adopted. Similar efforts were undertaken in our world but fell apart due to distrust. Russia, with its closer ties to Iran, would be able to keep the Iranians under closer scrutiny without antagonizing them, preventing their efforts at developing nuclear weapons. With its ties to China, Russia could help organize negotiations between itself, the US, and China to denuclearize North Korea and devise a resolution to the North-South divide. Russia and the US using their overwhelming might to intimidate the North Koreans and Chinese into an agreement if all else failed. Russia's proximity to China would also put them in a unique position to pressure the Chinese over land while the US maintained its chain of allies at sea. This would allow for a far more effective containment of China, preventing it from growing into a larger threat. What agenda Russia and the US would seek to impose upon China is difficult to say. It's possible the US could seek to democratize China or even pursue its division under the guise of promoting national sovereignty for Xinjiang, Tibet, and even Manchuria, the latter of which only really existing as a buffer state for Russia's underpopulated Far Eastern territories. China could also be reunited with Taiwan in a similar compromise to that of Korea, however strong lingering communist elements would almost certainly continue within China regardless of the approach. In a more moderate approach, Russia and the US may simply pressure China to denuclearize at the same pace as themselves, exhausting China's nuclear arsenal well before Russia and the US exhausted theirs. Russia, in a reciprocal arrangement, may ask the same of France and Britain in Europe, and to a lesser extent India, Pakistan, and Israel. This could very well begin a schism in relations between the US and Europe, as well as between Russia and China, with France and Britain hesitating to denuclearize as trust in Russia would have still been shaky in this region, many fearing the threat of a Russian invasion. As they were with China, Russia would be in a strong position to pressure Europe into cooperation and may even incentivize them by promoting an integration of their economies, allowing the countries of Europe to benefit from Russia's natural resources while the Russians drew in business from the Atlantic countries. Questions of course arise for what would become of Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Russia would of course still consider Ukraine and Belarus as integral parts of its sphere, but rather than push for direct annexation, may instead use political and economic influence to sway Ukraine into a position akin to Belarus, with a reliably pro-Russian government which effectively acts at their behest, though still retains some autonomy. In such an arrangement, Crimea or the separatist regions in eastern Ukraine probably won't come under invasion or even see referendums for reintegration into Russia, given Russia's confidence in Ukraine's position within their sphere. Russian efforts would also be made to strengthen ties with the Baltic countries through more diplomatic and economic means, as these states could be expected to remain reasonably skeptical until Russia's reputation as a supportive figure within Europe settled in. Insofar as the Middle East, Russia would generally maintain close ties with the states of Iraq, Syria, and potentially Turkey, though if tensions remained high between Turkey and Russia's allies, it may throw its support behind Kurdish secessionists in the east to create a geographically contiguous bloc. A world where the US and Russia had become allies early on would have seen wars avoided, mutual threats pacified, and a new global order established, one which wasn't so unipolar and ideologically one-sided, but balanced and nuanced. However, if Russia and the US failed to play their cards right, this alternate timeline could also spawn disaster. China retaliating against both Russia and the United States despite the odds against it, war between the unweakened rival powers of the Middle East, Europe cutting ties with both Russia and the US in response to a sense of subjugation to both. But what do you think? What might have happened had the US and Russia become allies? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Mr. Z, out.